The dust had barely settled behind the Land Cruiser when Daniel first saw her. She came from the left side of the track, not fast, not startled, simply stepping out of the long, dry grass the way something steps through a doorway it has used before. One moment there was only the pale corridor of cracked earth stretching ahead of him, flanked on both sides by silver thorn scrub and brittle mopane, and the next moment there was a leopard standing in the center of it, 10 meters, maybe 12, close enough that he could see the individual markings along her shoulders, the way her coat shifted between amber and ash depending on how the early light fell across her. Daniel's foot moved to the brake before his mind had formed a complete thought. The Land Cruiser stopped, the engine idled, and the leopard did not move. That was the first thing that registered as wrong. Not wrong in the way of danger, wrong in the way of something that falls outside every pattern a person has learned to read. In 3 years of driving this corridor, Daniel had encountered leopards exactly 4 times. Each occasion had lasted no more than a few seconds, a shape resolving itself from rock or grass, amber eyes holding his for one suspended moment, and then nothing, a disappearance so clean and sudden it left him wondering whether he had imagined it. Leopards in this reserve were not habituated to vehicles. They were not part of any tourism circuit. They were fully wild, shaped entirely by their own instincts and the long history of being the most secretive of the large cats. They did not stand in the middle of roads in the growing morning light. This one stood, and she kept standing. Daniel turned off the engine, not because protocol required it, but because the silence felt necessary, felt like the right response to whatever this was. The bush around him went on with its ordinary business. A hornbill called twice from somewhere in the mopane, then stopped. The dry grass made its small, papery sound in the faint movement of air. But the leopard did not shift, did not blink away, did not drop into the crouching, retreating posture of an animal that wants distance. Her tail moved slowly, low to the ground, a sweep that was not agitation. It was the movement of an animal thinking, processing, deciding something. He had been trained to read the language that wild animals carry in their bodies. The flattened ear, that means threat assessment. The raised tail, that means elevated alertness. The tucked hindquarters that signal imminent retreat. He ran through the entire vocabulary now, applying each word to what he was seeing, and none of it fit. Her ears were forward, not flat. Her shoulders were square, not drawn back. Her gaze was fixed on the windshield on him, specifically him, with an intensity that was not aggression. It was something else entirely, something for which his training had not given him a word. She took 3 steps toward the vehicle. Deliberate steps, each one placed with care, the way a large cat moves when it is not hunting and not fleeing but navigating something in between. She stopped again, closer now, perhaps 8 meters. Her breath was faintly visible in the early chill of the morning, small white wisps rising from her muzzle and dissolving immediately in the dry air. Her eyes were the color of the river in late afternoon amber at the center, shifting to something greener toward the outer edge, and they did not leave him. Daniel was aware of his own breathing. He kept it slow. He kept his hands open and visible on the steering wheel, a habit built from years in the field, a way of making the body say what the voice cannot. He did not reach for his camera. He did not reach for his radio. He understood, in the particular way that comes from years of sitting quietly inside wild places, that anything he reached for right now would be the wrong thing to reach for. This moment required only his stillness. A full minute passed, possibly 2. Time in the field moves differently than time elsewhere. It stretches and compresses according to what is happening inside it, and what was happening now felt enormous and weightless at the same time. The leopard stood in the morning light at the center of the pale track, and the world around her continued its quiet activity, completely indifferent to what was passing between them. Then she turned her head. It was a small movement, not a flinch, not a startle, a deliberate rotation of her head toward the tree line on the left side of the track. She held that position for 2 or 3 seconds, as if indicating something, as if drawing his attention to a direction. Then she turned back and looked at him again. Her eyes were steady. Her body was still. Daniel's chest moved with a slow breath. He had seen this kind of thing described in field journals, a behavior so rare that most researchers who encountered it questioned their own account of it afterward. An animal at the edge of wild and human space, doing something that could not be filed neatly under any standard behavioral category. Not threatening, not curious in the easy tourist sense, something more deliberate than either. He looked at the tree line where she had directed his gaze. He could see nothing from the vehicle, only the interlocking shadows of leadwood and fig, the pale flash of a granite rock shelf, the deep cool of a dry stream bed. Whatever was there was not visible to him from where he sat. He looked back at her. She was still watching him, waiting. "Okay," he said so quietly the word barely left his mouth. "I'm here." She did not move at the sound of his voice. She did not flinch or flatten. She simply continued to hold his gaze across the dusty morning air, patient and present in a way that wild animals almost never are. And the stillness between them held like something fragile and important, like the moment before a door opens, when everything on the other side is still unknown. She moved first. There was no dramatic pivot, no sudden urgency in her body. She simply turned, the way water turns around a stone, and began walking toward the tree line she had indicated with that brief, deliberate glance. Her movement was unhurried and low to the ground, each paw placed with the particular quietness that large cats carry naturally in their bodies, a silence that seems almost architectural, built into the way their weight distributes, the way their joints absorb each step. The dry grass parted for her and closed again, and within a few seconds she had reached the edge of the scrub. There she stopped. She looked back at the vehicle. Daniel had not moved. She waited. 4 seconds, perhaps 5. Then she took 2 more steps into the shadow of the first trees and stopped again, looked back again. The pattern of it was impossible to misread, and yet Daniel sat with it for a long moment anyway, because misreading it in the other direction, projecting onto a wild animal, a kind of intention that existed only in his own need to find meaning, was the more familiar professional failure. He was careful about that. He had always been careful about that. But the behavior in front of him was not ambiguous in the way that most animal behavior is ambiguous. She was not retreating. She was not circling. She was moving away from him at a pace that paused repeatedly to confirm that he was still there. He opened the door. He did it slowly, pushing it wide and letting it rest against its hinge without letting it swing or bang. He sat on the edge of the seat with his boots in the dust and went through the reasonable assessment that the situation required. She was a wild leopard, not a study animal, not fitted with a tracking collar, not associated with any habituation program. She was in full health and full strength, and he was about to follow her, on foot, into dense bush, alone and without telling anyone where he was going. Every protocol he had built his field practice around argued against what his body was already preparing to do. He reached back into the cab and took his radio from the console. He clipped it to his belt without turning it on. Then he stood up. He moved the way the situation demanded slowly, with his weight distributed evenly, his body angled very slightly sideways, the posture that removes the confrontational geometry of a person facing an animal head-on. He kept his arms low and his hands open. He left the vehicle door ajar rather than closing it, because the sound of the latch would have been the wrong sound, a sharp intrusion into the particular quietness that had settled over the morning since she had first appeared. Everything now was about staying inside that quietness without disturbing it. She watched him rise from the vehicle. Her ears stayed forward. Her tail continued its low, unhurried movement. She gave no sign of alarm as he took his first 2 steps toward her across the pale dust of the track, and when he had covered that small distance, she turned again and continued into the scrub. He followed. The ground changed immediately on the other side of the track edge. The soil was darker here, softened by the shade of the leadwood canopy, and it gave slightly under his boots in a way that muffled his footfall. The thicket pressed in around him, fig and leadwood and wild buffalo thorn growing in close, their branches interlocking overhead and filtering the morning light into something fragmented and cool. The smell of the place was different too, deeper and more mineral, the particular scent of soil and old root, and the faint green presence of things that still held moisture inside them despite the dry season around them. She moved through all of it without touching a single branch. He moved through it more clumsily, choosing his steps with care, and still occasionally brushing a thorn branch or displacing a loose stone underfoot. Each time he made a sound, she would pause and look back, and each time she found him still following, she would continue. It did not feel like tolerance. It felt like confirmation, a repeated checking that the agreement between them was still holding. The ground began to slope downward toward what he recognized as one of the dry tributaries of the main river channel, a seasonal stream that ran with water for perhaps 6 weeks of the year and lay pale and silent the rest of the time. The vegetation along its edges was thicker than the surrounding bush, fed by the residual moisture deep in the sand, and the trees here were larger, their canopies broader, their roots exposed and twisted above the soil surface like the fingers of something old and permanent. It was exactly the kind of terrain a leopard would choose for concealment, elevated slightly on a shelf of granite that rose on the far side of the stream bed, shaded by a fig tree old enough to have spread its arms across 12 meters of ground. She stopped at the base of the granite shelf and sat down, not crouching, not alert. She sat in the particular way of an animal that has arrived at its destination, and she looked at Daniel with the same steady, direct attention she had offered him on the road. Then she looked downward, toward the depression in the rock just beneath the slight overhang of the shelf's upper edge. Daniel stopped walking. He stood at the edge of the stream bed, perhaps 15 meters from her, and he listened. The sound was so faint he doubted it for a full second before he heard it again, thin and wavering, barely above the threshold of sound, less a cry than the idea of one, the smallest possible expression of a need that had not yet found its full voice. He stood completely still and let the sound locate itself in the space before him. It was coming from the rock shelf, from whatever lay in the depression she was guarding. He took 3 steps closer, slow and careful, and then he saw them, and the morning around him shifted in the way mornings sometimes do when they contain something that will stay with a person for the rest of their life. "Base," he said quietly into his radio, his voice steady and low. "I need Dr. Reyes out here." Dr. Amara Reyes arrived the way Daniel had asked her to quietly. She left her vehicle on the track beside his and covered the distance to the stream on foot, following the path he had marked with a series of small cairns built from the pale stones of the dry channel floor. She carried the field kit in both hands rather than over her shoulder, keeping her profile low and her movements measured. She had worked in wild felid conservation for 11 years, and she understood before she arrived what quiet would cost and what noise might undo. Daniel met her at the edge of the stream bed and said nothing, only gestured with a slight tilt of his head toward the granite shelf. She looked, assessed the distance between the mother and the cubs, noted the position of the fig tree and the angle of the overhang, and then she set her kit down on a flat stone and opened it without a word. The 2 cubs lay in a shallow depression in the rock, tucked together inside the curve of the overhang where the stone held the faint warmth of yesterday's sun. The healthy one moved continuously, its small paws working in blind, reflexive circles, its mouth opening and closing against the stone. It was the movement of a newborn navigating entirely by warmth and scent, a body that did not yet have a concept of the world beyond immediate need. The second cub lay beside it without moving. Its rosettes were still faint, blurred against the pale fur the way watercolor spreads before it dries, and its breathing, when Amara leaned close enough to observe it, came in intervals that were too long and too shallow for an animal this young. She worked from the outside in, the way field assessment requires observing before touching, reading the whole animal before isolating any part of it. The cub's posture was collapsed rather than resting, a distinction that matters enormously and is visible in the way weight settles differently into the ground. Its hind legs lay at a slight angle that suggested weakness rather than sleep. When she gently lifted its lip with one gloved finger, the gum tissue beneath was pale, not white, which would have meant something graver, but far from the healthy pink it should have been. She palpated its abdomen with 2 careful fingers, noted the slight firmness there, and checked the small wound on its left flank that she had not seen until she turned it slightly toward the available light. A shallow puncture, almost invisible beneath the fur, darkened at its edges in the way wounds darken when the body has been quietly fighting something for longer than it should have had to. She did not speak any of this aloud. She reached into the kit and began. The mother had settled in the deep shade of the fig tree, perhaps 18 meters from the shelf, and she paced. Not frantically, her pacing had the low, controlled quality of an animal managing something internal, a restlessness contained within a decision that had already been made. 3 steps in one direction, a pause, 3 steps back. Her attention moved between Amara and the cubs in a continuous, unwavering circuit, and every few minutes she would stop pacing entirely and simply stand, watching, with the particular stillness of a predator assessing whether a threshold had been crossed. Daniel sat to the side of the shelf on a low rock, positioned between Amara and the tree line, and he watched the mother the entire time. His job was not to assist. His job was to be a reader of limits, to know. Before the leopard's body showed it fully, when the tolerance that held this entire fragile arrangement together was approaching its edge. It held. Amara administered fluid subcutaneously, working with a needle so fine that the cub's body registered almost no response to it beyond a slight tightening of the skin. She kept the injection slow and patient, allowing the fluid to absorb gradually rather than pooling beneath the tissue. She cleaned the wound on the flank with an antiseptic solution, applied on a cloth square, rather than sprayed. The aerosol sound of a spray in this quiet would have been too much, and she dressed it with a small adhesive patch from the kit that would hold for the several days it would need to. She wrapped the cub loosely in a heat-reflective cloth, leaving its face and the upper part of its body visible so that the mother's next approach would find something that still looked and smelled like her cub and not like an object that had been replaced by human hands. She worked for an hour, possibly slightly longer. The morning climbed around them, and the temperature rose, and the shadow under the fig tree shortened as the sun moved, and the mother paced her three-step arc, and then stood still, and then paced again. Once, near the middle of the hour, the leopard produced a sound. It was low and brief, barely a vocalization, something between a murmur and an exhale. The specific sound a female makes to her cubs in the dark, a sound meant for no other audience. The healthy cub responded to it immediately, shifting its body toward the direction of the sound, its small head lifting for a moment before settling back. The sick cub did not respond. But Amara registered the sound and worked slightly faster in the minutes that followed, not urgently, but with the quiet acceleration of someone who has heard a clock she hadn't noticed before. And then, with no announcement, the breathing changed. It deepened, first one breath that was fuller than the one before it, followed by another that was fuller still, as if the body were remembering something it had been close to forgetting. The interval between breaths shortened. The collapsed posture shifted slightly, a faint tension returning to the limbs, a gathering of something that had been absent. The cub's hind legs moved in two small swimming motions. Then its mouth opened and produced a sound thin and unsteady and imperfect. The sound of a voice that has not yet found its full register, but unmistakably, completely alive. Amara sat back on her heels and allowed herself one slow breath. The mother was on her feet and crossing the ground before the sound had fully faded. She moved without hesitation, covering the distance in silence, and she stopped 2 body lengths from Amara and stood there with her full attention directed at the cubs. She did not look at Amara again. She lowered her head and pressed her nose to the top of the healthy cub, holding it there, breathing it in with long, deliberate inhalations. Then she moved to the sick one and did the same, slower this time, the contact lasting longer, her breath moving across the top of the small head in a steady, warm rhythm. She remained bent over the cub for a long moment, absolutely still. Amara began packing the kit. She moved each item slowly, without the sound of metal against metal, her hands performing the familiar task by feel as much as by sight. She did not look at the leopard directly. "He's going to need time," she said softly, to Daniel, not to the animal. "But he's here." Daniel had forgotten entirely about the dash camera. It was a standard field unit, wide angle, and fixed low on the windshield. The kind installed at most research stations for road survey documentation, wildlife crossings, erosion mapping, the ordinary visual record of corridors that no one expects to contain anything extraordinary. It had been running since he turned the engine on that morning, as it ran every morning, accumulating footage that was reviewed briefly at week's end and stored on a hard drive that lived in a drawer at base camp. He had not thought about it once from the moment the leopard stepped onto the track to the moment he and Amara walked back to the vehicles 4 hours later. There had been no room for that kind of peripheral awareness. Everything that morning had required the whole of his attention. When he settled back into the driver's seat, the small red recording light on the dash unit blinked steadily in his peripheral vision. He looked at it for several seconds without moving. Then he reached forward and stopped the recording. He removed the memory card and held it between his fingers, a thing so small and ordinary that it seemed wrong for it to contain what he suspected it contained. He drove back to base camp without the radio on. The card sat in the cup holder beside him the entire way, and he looked at it at intervals, the way a person looks at something they are not yet sure what to do with. That night, he transferred the footage to his laptop and watched it alone at the table in the research station's small common room, with the overhead light off and only the screen illuminating the space around him. The wide-angle lens had distorted the edges of the image in the way field cameras do, and the dust on the windshield caught the morning light in small, irregular flares. But the center of the frame was clear, the track was clear, and the Leopard, when she stepped onto it, was perfectly visible, her body square to the vehicle, her attention fixed and unmistakable even through glass and distance and the slight compression of the lens. He watched himself open the door. He watched the empty vehicle, the idling dust, the ordinary corridor of pale earth holding its shape while somewhere beyond the frame something extraordinary was happening. He watched Amara arrive and disappear toward the stream bed. He watched the vehicle sit. He watched the light change as the morning advanced and the sun moved across the sky in the particular way it moves in the dry season, flattening rather than warming, clarifying every detail of the ground and the scrub and the pale track stretching ahead. And then, at the very end of the footage, he watched himself and Amara return from the stream bed and walk back toward the vehicles. They moved slowly, their bodies angled away from the shelf, giving the mother back her territory with the only language available to them, distance and avoidance, and the deliberate shrinking of their presence. Amara reached her vehicle first. Daniel was a few meters behind her, and it was at this moment, in the last 40 seconds of the recording, that the Leopard reappeared. She came back to the edge of the granite shelf and stood there. She looked at Amara, she looked at the ground, and then she turned her gaze directly toward Daniel, and she held it. The timestamp ran in the lower right corner of the frame. Daniel watched it move. 1 second. 2. He sat very still at the table in the dark common room, watching a recording of himself standing in the morning bush while a wild leopard looked at him with an attention so complete and so unreadable that it seemed to require a language that neither species fully possessed. 5 seconds. 6, 7, and then she turned, walked back along the shelf, and lowered herself to her cubs, and the frame held only the empty granite edge and the fig tree and the ordinary morning continuing beyond it. He sat with the footage for a long time before he did anything else. He did not send it immediately. He was cautious about that, in the same way he had been cautious about following her into the bush, aware of the gap between what had happened and what the world would make of what had happened. She had not performed, she had not offered a gesture for an audience. Whatever had passed between them on that shelf of rock had been functional and instinctive and complete in itself, and the idea of handing it outward felt like a kind of translation that would inevitably lose something essential in the crossing. But he was also a conservationist, and he understood what documented evidence of wild leopard behavior in this corridor could mean for the long-term protection of the land. He wrote a short, plainly worded message to the Conservation Network's media coordinator, 4 sentences describing what had occurred, framed in the careful language of field observation. No superlatives, no emotional framing. He attached the footage and submitted it before he could revise it further, and then he went to sleep. Within 48 hours, the footage had been viewed by millions of people across more than 60 countries. What struck those who watched it and what they said, in the comment sections and the message threads and the quiet conversations that footage sometimes generates between strangers who have witnessed the same thing, was not the size of the leopard or the smallness of the cubs or the shape of the human intervention barely visible in the background. It was the 7 seconds. It was the way she stood at the edge of the shelf and looked at him with an attention that the wide-angle lens, for all its distortion, could not diminish or misrepresent. People who had never been inside wild bush, and people who had spent decades there, watched the same 7 seconds and arrived at the same place, a stillness inside themselves that they could not immediately explain and did not immediately try to. Wildlife behaviorists weighed in carefully, as they should. They noted the complexity of attributing intention to the gaze of a solitary felid. They contextualized the behavior within the broader literature of stress responses, maternal instinct, and the documented cases of wild animal tolerance at sites of human intervention. They were responsible and measured and largely correct. Daniel read their analyses and agreed with most of what they said. He gave one interview to a conservation publication because the coordinator asked him to and because it seemed like the appropriate forum. He answered the questions in the same plain language he used in his field reports. Near the end of the interview, the journalist asked him what he thought the leopard had understood about what they had done for her cubs that morning. He considered the question for a moment. "I don't know what she understood," he said, "but I know she looked." The journalist printed the line at the end of the piece. Editors at other publications quoted it without the surrounding context. It moved through the world in the way that simple, true things sometimes do, without velocity, without drama, arriving quietly in the reading of people who needed it to arrive. Daniel returned to his field surveys the following week. He drove the same corridor. He documented the same crossings, the same erosion patterns, the same inventory of ordinary life that the land offered every morning to anyone patient enough to record it. The dash camera blinked its small red light. The dust settled behind the vehicle. The bush continued. The rains came early to the corridor that year. Not the heavy, theatrical storms of midsummer that turn the dry riverbeds into rushing brown water and flatten the tall grass into mats, but a gentler, more tentative arrival, the kind that comes in the night as a soft, persistent sound on the roof of the research station and leaves the world the following morning transformed in every small way that matters. The soil darkened. The cracked pale tiles of the dry season disappeared beneath a surface that gave slightly underfoot, releasing a smell so deep and complete that it seemed less like rain and more like the earth, exhaling something it had been holding for months. The grass along the track verges responded than Uthay's first, a faint greening at the base of each stem, then a gradual lit, the whole corridor brightening from the ground up, as if light were coming from below rather than above. Daniel had been back at the reserve for 2 weeks when he drove the Mwanzi corridor again for the first time since the footage had traveled its way around the world. He had not avoided the route deliberately. There had been other sections of the survey grid requiring attention, other coordinates to document, other mornings occupied by the ordinary and necessary work of conservation fieldwork that continues regardless of what extraordinary things occasionally interrupt it. But he was aware, in the way a person is aware of a place they are not yet ready to return to, that he had been finding reasons to go elsewhere. He drove it on a Tuesday, in the early morning, when the light was still low and golden and the wet grass along the verges caught it in a way that made the whole corridor look briefly precious. He drove at survey pace, slow, engine, quiet, windows down so that the sounds of the bush could enter the vehicle and be registered alongside the visual data he was recording. The track was soft from the recent rain, and the tires moved through it with a muffled, gripping sound. The air coming through the windows smelled of wet earth and new leaves and something faintly floral that he could not identify. The smell of a landscape remaking itself after months of holding still. He was not looking for her. He had decided that clearly enough in his own mind during the 2 weeks since his return, and he had held to it as a kind of discipline, the same discipline that fieldwork requires in all its forms, the practice of observing what is present rather than searching for what one hopes to find. She was a wild leopard in full health with 2 cubs in a recovering landscape. She did not owe him a sighting. She did not owe him anything at all. What had passed between them had been complete in itself, and the part of him that wanted to see her again was the human part, the part that needed narrative closure and visible proof, and he had learned over years in the field to be gently skeptical of that part. The cubs came out of the grass first. They emerged from the left verge, perhaps 40 meters ahead of the vehicle, one immediately behind the other, moving with the particular combination of confidence and clumsiness that belongs specifically to young animals in the weeks when the world is still slightly larger than their ability to navigate it. They were unmistakable. 7 weeks had done what 7 weeks does to leopard cubs, deepening and sharpening their rosettes into something approaching their adult pattern, lengthening their legs into instruments that were beginning to carry them efficiently, even as they still stumbled occasionally over their own enthusiasm. One of them veered toward the track and stopped at the edge of a puddle left by the recent rain, its body dropping into a low, startled crouch at its own reflection, and then it leaped sideways into the grass with the reflexive, full-body commitment of an animal that has not yet learned to be embarrassed by its own reactions. Daniel stopped the engine. He did not reach for the survey tablet. He did not reach for the radio or the camera or any of the equipment that occupied the cab around him. He simply stopped the engine and let his hands rest on the wheel and watched. The second cub followed the first into the grass without hesitation, and without replicating the alarm, it simply went where the other had gone, drawn by the same instinct that keeps young animals close to each other in the first months of a life that is still mostly proximity and warmth and the reliable presence of those who were there at the beginning. Both cubs disappeared into the green for a moment, only the trembling of the wet grass marking their passage, and then the first one reappeared briefly at the track edge, looked at the vehicle with the wide, shallow attention of an animal that has not yet learned what vehicles are, and retreated again. She came through the grass a few seconds later. She moved at a pace that was entirely her own unhurried, fluid, the ground-covering walk of a leopard in her territory, on a morning that belongs to her. Her coat was in full condition, dense and brilliant in the soft post-rain light, the rosettes along her flanks and shoulders rendered in such precise contrast that she looked almost unreal against the new green of the corridor verge. She was heavier through the body than she had been 6 weeks ago, fed well in a recovering landscape, carrying herself with the particular ease of an animal that is exactly where and what it is meant to be. She crossed the track in 4 long, unhurried strides, paused at the far edge just long enough to confirm with a glance that the cubs had followed, and then continued into the grass on the other side. She did not look at the vehicle. She did not look at Daniel. Her gaze swept past the Land Cruiser in the way her gaze would sweep past a termite mound or a fallen log, registering it as part of the landscape, neither significant nor threatening, simply present. The 7 seconds on the granite shelf had been what they were, and this was what it was, and the two things existed in different registers entirely. She was not withholding something. She was simply, completely, a leopard moving through her corridor on a wet Tuesday morning, with her cubs alive behind her and the whole of the recovering season spread before her. The grass closed around her, and she was gone. Daniel sat with the engine off for a long time. The corridor settled back into its ordinary sounds, the first insects reclaiming the morning air, a fish eagle calling from the direction of the main channel, the soft movement of wind through the new wet grass along the verges. A single drop of water fell from the mopane branch above the vehicle and landed on the hood with a sound so small it was almost nothing. He thought about what he would write in the survey report for this section of the corridor. 2 adult-accompanied juvenile leopards, estimated 7 weeks of age, both individuals in apparent full health, maternal behavior consistent with established territory use. He started the engine eventually and drove on, and the green closed behind him the same way it had closed behind her completely and without looking back.